can't say I'm proud of it, but I had, even at that age, enough lucidity of mind not to imagine I was engaged in a war. And that's what was happening in Gaza. It was like a child playing with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. About 13 to 1,400 Palestinians were killed, up to as many as 4/5 were civilians. About 350 children were killed. The total, about 300, the estimates are 353 to 358 children were killed. The total Israeli casualties came to about 10 combatants killed, not about, we know exactly. 10 combatants were killed. Half of those 10 were killed due to friendly fire, Israelis accidentally killing each other. And 3 civilians were killed. So it was a ratio of about 100 to 1. 100 Palestinians were killed for each Israeli killed, and the civilians was about 400 Israeli civilians killed for every Palestinian that was killed.
That's the other way.
400 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed. I would want to just make a side comment there. There was much criticism of a lot of the human rights reports, including the Goldstone reports, which it was alleged they were disproportionate, the reports, in their allocation of space to criticism of Israel and criticism of the Palestinians. And in fact, they were disproportionate, but the disproportionality goes in the opposite direction than what was claimed against these reports. If you take the Goldstone report, to which I'll return presently, it devoted about 1/5, between about 1/10, I'm trying to estimate now, I would say it devoted about 10% of the report to what happened in Israel, and about 90% of what happened to Palestinians. So it's a ratio of about 9 to 1, roughly speaking. But if you look at the actual numbers, say for example, numbers killed, the ratio is about 400 to 1. Civilians killed, total killed about 100 to 1. Or you take something like damage done to infrastructure, about 6,000 Palestinian homes were ravaged during those days in Gaza. In the case of Israel, Amnesty International wrote that one house was almost completely destroyed. So the ratio was roughly about 6,000 to 1 when it came to houses. As I said, about 100 to 1 when it came to total casualties, 400 to 1 when it came to civilians. So Goldstone devoted about 10% of his report to Israel. He gave it much more space than the objective data actually warranted. And that was true of all the reports. In the case of Human Rights Watch, time doesn't allow me to go into detail. Human Rights Watch put out 5 reports. Of those 5 reports, 2 of the 5, 40%, were devoted to criticizing the Palestinians. I have all this fuss over the Goldstone report. Israelis were obviously very upset by that report. If you take the liberal end of the spectrum, say Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, who is alleged in the U.S. that he's a historian, Michael Oren called the Goldstone report, he said it's worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers. That Hamas used civilians as human shields. And all the human rights reports were very careful to investigate that charge. All the human rights reports came to the same conclusion. So Amnesty International found, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. On the other hand, there was ample evidence, most exhaustively documented by the Goldstone report, that Israel used Palestinians, including Palestinian children, as human shields. Israel only provided evidence, or the claims to be evidence, for December 31st and January 1st, where they said that there were secondary explosions in some of the mosques after they targeted them, which basically means that you drop some missile or bomb on a mosque, and then after it explodes, there are secondary explosions, which supposedly indicates that there were weapons hidden there. But after January 1st, Israel itself stopped making the claim that there were secondary explosions. It's a temperature of 800 degrees centigrade, 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, and they dropped white phosphorus in Al-Quds Hospital and the second hospital, and many of the hospitals were attacked. The grounds Israel gave was that the hospitals were being used as refuge for Hamas militants. That charge, too, was exhaustively investigated by all the human rights organizations, and all the human rights organizations reached the same conclusion. There's no evidence whatsoever that those hospitals were being misused by Hamas militants.